The worst day of my life began with an ordinary phone call. "Elena, you need to come to the Astoria right away," my fiancé, Andrei, said over the line. "The fate of our biggest contract is being decided today, and I need your help." I froze with the phone in my hand. "My help? But just yesterday you said I'd only get in the way at the negotiations." A brief pause hung on the other end of the line. "I changed my mind. Just come over and try to look the part." Those last words sounded strange. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was wearing a simple gray suit, with my hair pulled back into a neat bun. No expensive jewelry, just a thin wristwatch from my father. There was a time when Andrei loved me for precisely that reason, telling me I was different from everyone else. I spoke 9 languages fluently, had graduated from the Faculty of International Economics, and worked for several years as an interpreter at high-level business meetings. But after our engagement, Andrei gradually convinced me that it was time to live a quieter life. "You work too hard. A woman doesn't constantly need to prove her worth. Focus on planning the wedding instead." I believed him. Yet now he was calling me himself, asking me to attend the most important negotiation of his career. 40 minutes later, I walked into the hotel's luxurious hall and instantly realized that Andrei had lied. Standing beside him was a striking young woman in a form-fitting burgundy dress, holding Andrei's arm as naturally as if she had every right to do so. I stopped in my tracks. Andrei saw me and turned pale for a second. "Elena, you actually came? You asked me to?" I shifted my gaze to the woman. She smiled warmly. "Marina?" She introduced herself. "I handle international relations for Andrei's company." I didn't answer because I already knew Marina, though not in person. A few months ago, I had accidentally noticed her name in Andrei's messages, but he told me she was merely a new employee and nothing special. Now she stood beside my fiancé, resting her hand on his shoulder. I looked straight at Andrei. "So it's her." He frowned. "Don't make a scene." I asked a simple question. Marina chuckled softly. "Elena, now is not the time for jealousy. We have serious negotiations ahead." I felt a chill run through me. They had actually brought his mistress to a major business meeting, a meeting they had invited me to attend. I was about to turn around and walk out when Andrei stopped me. Sit somewhere in the back. We need to show the partners that the full team is assembled." I looked into his eyes. "And what about Marina? Is she part of the team too?" He stayed silent. At that moment, the doors swung open, and the delegation of foreign investors walked in. Everyone immediately stood up. At the head of the group was an elderly man in a flawless dark blue suit, followed by several assistants, lawyers, and interpreters. I recognized him instantly. Richard van Deren, one of the most influential negotiators in Europe. I had worked with him years ago at a conference in Geneva. He looked toward me as well, though he didn't seem to recognize me. Andrei hurried forward. "Mr. van Deren, welcome. It's an honor." The man shook his hand smoothly. "I hope we finally reach an agreement today." We walked over to the long conference table. Marina sat right next to Andrei, while I was pointed to a seat at the very end. I sat down and glanced at the documents spread across the table in English, French, and German. Within a minute, the negotiations began, and I quickly realized that Andrei had no idea what was going on. He tried to explain the terms of the deal in English, but kept confusing financial terminology. Marina tried to intervene, saying, "He means," but the investor's interpreter corrected her several times. Richard grew colder by the second. I remained silent until one of the representatives spoke up in French. Neither Andrei nor Marina understood a word. Instinctively, I responded to him directly in fluent French. Everyone turned toward me. Andrei hurriedly whispered, "Elena, keep quiet." I looked at him, and for the first time, I genuinely did not care what he wanted. I continued in French, calmly explaining the disputed clause of the contract. Richard raised his eyebrows. "You speak French?" "I do." He posed a follow-up question in German, and I answered him seamlessly in German. Then, one of the Asian representatives unexpectedly spoke in Chinese, and I replied to him in Chinese. Silence fell over the room. Andrei stared at me as if seeing me for the very first time. Richard smiled. Fascinating. I seamlessly transitioned into Spanish, then Italian, Portuguese, Arabic, Japanese, and finally back to English. 9 languages. 9 languages that Andrea had once dismissed as my useless hobby. Now no one else in the room uttered a single word. Marina turned pale, and Andrei attempted to jump in. Mr. Van Daren, my fiancé, was just... Richard raised a hand to interrupt him. Your fiancé? Andrei hesitated. Yes. Then why is she sitting at the far end of the table? The question was delivered calmly, but Andrei could not find an answer. Richard turned to me. Miss Elena, had you reviewed these documents prior to the meeting? I received them only this morning. Did you notice an error then? I nodded. More than one. He leaned forward. Show me. I took the folder and, within a few minutes, pointed out 3 critical oversights that could have led to millions in losses for the investors. The lawyer sitting across from me quickly scanned the pages, his expression instantly changing. She's right. Whispers broke out across the room. Richard looked back at Andrei. Who drafted this contract, my team? Then why is the only person who noticed these critical errors sitting at the bottom of the table? Andrei remained completely silent. A strange sense of calm washed over me. For the first time in months, I stopped trying to be convenient, stopped fearing his reactions, and stopped thinking about our wedding. Richard closed the folder. We will take a 20-minute break. As everyone began to stand up, I rose from my seat as well. Suddenly, Richard walked over to me and extended his hand. I reached out for a standard handshake, but instead, he gently took my hand above the wrist and stared intently at my thin watch. His face transformed instantly. This watch. I looked down at it. What about it? He touched the watch face lightly with his finger. Where did you get this? It was a gift from my father. Richard froze. What was your father's name? My breath caught in my throat. Alexander Volkov's. Silence settled over the room once more. Richard slowly released my hand. It can't be. Andrei frowned, stepping closer. Did you know her father? Richard didn't even glance at him. His eyes were fixed entirely on me. Your father worked with me 22 years ago. I blinked in surprise. Are you sure? Absolutely. He took a step back. I gave him this exact watch on the day we signed our very first international contract. I looked at the watch, then back at him. My father always told me it was a gift from an old friend. Richard smiled softly. He never liked boasting about his achievements. Andrei abruptly cut in. Mr. Van Daren, perhaps we should continue discussing the deal without... Richard turned sharply. Without her. Number, she is the exact person I want sitting at the head of this table. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, but that was only the beginning. A few moments later, Richard opened his phone, looked at an old photograph, and spoke quietly. Elena, your father once saved my company from bankruptcy before he passed away. He asked me to find you if you ever needed help. I stood completely still. What are you saying? Richard turned his gaze to Andrei. I am saying that this contract should never have ended up in your fiancé's hands in the first place. Andrei abruptly stood up. What? Richard added calmly. Because the real company we intended to sign this agreement with doesn't belong to him. He looked back at me. It belongs to you. My fingers began to tremble. Andrei turned deathly pale, and Marina leaped up from her chair. That is impossible. Richard scoffed lightly. Well, that is precisely what we are about to verify. I stared at Richard, unable to process what was happening. The company belongs to me, I asked. He nodded. More accurately, the controlling stake was transferred to your father many years ago. Upon his passing, the management rights were meant to pass directly to you. Andrei let out a harsh, nervous laugh. This is some kind of mistake. Elena has never been involved in business. She has nothing to do with our company. Richard turned to him slowly. Are you certain? 100%. Then why have all the financial documents over the past 3 years been signed in the name of Elena Alexandrovna Volkova? The smirk vanished from Andrei's face. I felt my stomach drop. What documents? Richard glanced at his assistant, who pulled several sheets from a folder. Here are the copies. I took the papers. My name was printed on every single page, But the signature was not mine. I recognized the forgery immediately. I never signed these. Andrei grew paler by the second. Marina stared at him in disbelief. "Andrei, say something." I looked up. "What is going on?" He didn't answer. For the very first time, I saw genuine raw fear in his eyes, rather than irritation or contempt. Richard spoke up quietly. "Your fiancé used your name to execute several international agreements." I flipped through the pages. The further I read, the more my hands went numb. Millions, tens of millions of dollars were listed. Several transactions had been routed through shell companies I had never even heard of. "Andrei," I said softly, "you used my name." He took a step toward me. "Elena, listen to me. It is not what it looks like." "Then explain it." "I was trying to protect you." I nearly laughed aloud. "Protect me by bringing your mistress to the negotiations." Marina flinched as silence fell over the room. I looked straight at her. "Or is she part of your plan to protect me too?" Marina averted her gaze. And that was answer enough. Richard raised his hand. "Mr. Andrei, I strongly advise you not to sign anything or make any calls right now. You can't tell me what to do." "I can," Richard replied, pulling out his phone. "Because, as of this moment, every account tied to this international contract will be audited." Andrei panicked. "You'll destroy my company." "No," Richard answered smoothly. "If your documentation is clean, you have nothing to fear." Andrei turned to me desperately. "Elena, tell him to stop. You love me." Those words stung worse than anything else. Just yesterday, I might have cried. A week ago, I would have tried to make excuses for him. But right then, a cold clarity washed over me. I had loved a ghost. A man I had invented in my own mind. The real Andrei standing before me wasn't afraid of losing me. He was terrified of losing his money. I laid the documents back on the table. "Number," he frowned. "What?" "I am not going to save you. Andrei, you made your own choice." Marina suddenly stepped up to Andrei, touching his arm. "We need to talk." He shoved her hand away sharply. "Not now." She glared at him with pure hatred. "Of course, now I am useless to you." I froze as Marina continued. "You promised me that after today's meeting, she would find out about the divorce." The room went dead silent. I slowly turned my head toward Andrei. "The divorce?" He closed his eyes. It all made sense. They hadn't just intended to humiliate me or push me aside at the negotiations. Their plan was to declare a divorce after closing the deal, leaving me saddled with all the debt forged in my name. Richard frowned deeply. "Everything is becoming much clearer now." A strange, quiet strength settled inside me. "Andrei, tell me just one thing." He looked up at me. "Were you really going to leave me with all the debt? Number. Then why did your mistress just mention a divorce?" He had no answer. I nodded slowly. "I don't need to hear anything else." I grabbed my bag, but Richard stopped me. "Elena." I turned around. "Yes? Are you leaving?" "Yes." "Then walk out of this room with your head held high," he said gently, pausing for a moment. "But first, sign one document." I paused, cautious. "What document?" "A notice stating that you never authorized the use of your name or signature." The legal advisor nodded. "It is necessary to protect you legally." I signed the paper, this time with my true signature, and felt an immense weight lift off my shoulders for the first time all day. As I turned to go, Richard added, "Come to my office tomorrow at 10 in the morning. "Why?" He smiled softly. "Because it is time you learned what your father left for you." The next day, I arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. Richard met me personally and placed an old leather folder on the desk. "This belonged to your father." I opened it to find photos, documents, and a handwritten letter. I recognized the handwriting instantly. "Dad." My hands trembled as I read the lines. "Lena, if you are reading this, you are old enough to know the truth. I wanted you to choose your own path in life, which is why I never fully disclosed the extent of my business to you." Tears streamed down my cheeks. The letter explained that my father had founded an international investment group, securing a portion of the assets specifically so they couldn't be seized by outside partners. Upon his death, control was meant to pass to me, on one condition: I had to decide who I wanted to be on my own terms. Not someone's wife, not an appendage, but an independent person. I closed the letter. Why didn't he tell me sooner? Richard sighed. Because he was afraid people would love your money rather than you. Thinking of Andrei, I realized how thoroughly my father had understood human nature. That very day, I filed to invalidate every unauthorized transaction made in my name. The legal team launched a full investigation within a week. They proved that Andrei had used my identity to route massive transactions through his firm, intending to unload the resulting debt onto an entity linked to my inheritance. Marina had been complicit, feeding him confidential negotiation details for a price. When the fraud unraveled, both ended up under criminal investigation. For the first time in years, I stopped fearing the future. A month later, new negotiations were held. This time, I sat at the head of the table, with Richard by my side. That morning, he looked at me and said, "Today, you are no longer just Alexander Volkov's daughter." "Then who am I?" he smiled. "You are Elena Volkova, and that is more than enough." We signed the contract under vastly superior terms. Andrei tried contacting me repeatedly, first begging for forgiveness, then claiming he did it all for our future, and eventually blaming Marina. One evening, a message popped up on my screen. I realized what I lost. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing 4 words, "You lost me long ago." Then I blocked his number. 6 months later, I launched my own international enterprise. At our inaugural conference, delegates from 9 different countries were present. When one representative asked, "Which language would you prefer to conduct this in?" I smiled. "Any." The room laughed, but I was entirely serious. I was done shrinking myself for a man who was terrified of standing beside a strong woman. Afterward, Richard walked up to me. "Your father would be incredibly proud of you." I looked out the window. "Do you really think so?" "I am certain of it." He extended his hand. This time I shook it firmly. Realizing that the day my fiancé brought his mistress to those negotiations, thinking he was publicly humiliating me, he had actually given me the greatest gift of my life. He showed me his true face and forced me to finally discover my own strength. I was no longer the woman pushed to the end of the table. I was the woman invited to lead it, not because I was anyone's fiancé, and not just because of my father's legacy, but because I finally knew my own worth. When I eventually stepped back into that luxurious hotel hall where I had once stood beside, Andrei feeling completely out of place, I stopped at the head of the main table. Richard looked at me and smiled. "Ready?" I smiled back. "Always." Sometimes betrayal isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it is just the door you were always too afraid to open.